You wake up, and before your feet even touch the ground, something already feels off, not because anything dramatic has happened, but because there is a quiet weight sitting inside your chest, a subtle pressure that whispers you are behind, you are late, you are not where you should be. And so you move through the morning the way you always have, checking your phone, scanning messages, stepping into a routine that feels familiar but strangely empty. And you tell yourself this is normal. This is just life. This is what everyone does. But let me ask you something that most people avoid asking themselves. If this is truly the life you were meant to live, then why does it feel like something is missing, even when everything seems to be in place? Why does there remain this silent tension between who you are and who you sense you could become? And more importantly, where did that tension begin? There was a time, long before responsibilities, long before expectations, when you did not question your significance, when you did not need permission to believe that your life held meaning. You did not measure yourself against others. You did not shrink your ambitions to fit into what was considered realistic. You simply existed with a quiet certainty that you were here for something. Not something vague, not something distant, but something real, something personal, something that belonged to you alone. And then slowly, without you even noticing, that certainty began to fade, not because it was false, but because something else replaced it. You were introduced to a different story, a story that sounded reasonable, responsible, even wise, a story that told you life is about security, about stability, about following a path that has already been approved by those who came before you. You were taught to prepare rather than to pursue, to avoid risk rather than to embrace possibility, to wait rather than to act. And at first it seemed harmless, because it was presented as guidance, as protection, as a way to ensure that you would not fail. But hidden inside that guidance was a subtle trade, a trade so quiet that most people never realize it happened. You traded your sense of mission for a sense of safety, and once that trade is made, everything begins to change. Not all at once, not in a way that alarms you, but gradually, almost invisibly, you begin to make decisions not based on what calls you forward, but based on what keeps you comfortable. You begin to filter your choices through fear disguised as logic. You begin to measure your potential against what seems possible instead of what feels true. And over time, the life you are building no longer reflects who you are. It reflects what you have been taught to accept. This is the lie that most people never question. The lie that says you are here to fit in, to follow instructions, to earn your place by conforming to expectations that were never designed with you in mind. The lie that tells you your role is to survive rather than to create, to comply rather than to lead, to wait for permission rather than to move with purpose. And because this lie is repeated so often, because it is reinforced by everyone around you, because it is wrapped in the language of responsibility and maturity, you begin to believe it. Not consciously, not intentionally, but deeply enough that it shapes how you see yourself. You begin to forget that you ever felt different. You begin to forget that there was once a part of you that refused to settle, a part of you that imagined more, that expected more, that believed more was possible. And instead, you adopt a new identity, one that feels acceptable, one that feels safe, one that does not draw too much attention. And you call it being realistic. You call it growing up. You call it understanding how the world works. But in truth, what you have done is something far more significant. You have stepped away from the very thing that made your life yours. And here is where it becomes dangerous. Not because something obvious goes wrong, but because everything appears to be working. You follow the path. You meet the expectations. You do what is required. And on the surface, It looks like progress, but beneath that surface, something continues to pull at you, a quiet dissatisfaction that you cannot fully explain, a sense that no matter how much you achieve within this structure, it never quite feels complete. And so you try to fix it by doing more, by working harder, by pushing yourself further along the same path, believing that the problem is not the direction, but your effort. And this is how years pass. You give your time, your energy, your focus to a life that was never aligned with your deeper purpose. And because you are committed, because you are disciplined, because you are willing to endure, you become very good at living a life that does not belong to you. And the more skilled you become at maintaining it, the harder it becomes to question it. Because to question it would mean confronting something uncomfortable. It would mean admitting that you may have been building in the wrong direction, that you may have been following a script that was handed to you without your awareness. Most people never reach that realization, not because they are incapable, but because they are too deeply immersed in the routine to step back and see it clearly. They continue forward, adjusting small things, improving minor details, but never examining the foundation, never asking whether the structure itself was ever meant for them. And so they move through life with a constant undercurrent of unease, a feeling that something is off, but without the clarity to understand why. But you are here, listening to this, which means something in you has not been completely silenced. Something in you still recognizes that there is more, that there has always been more, and that recognition is not accidental. It is not random. It is not something to ignore. It is the very thing that was buried under years of conditioning, the very thing that the world trained you to overlook, the very thing that you are now beginning to remember. Because the truth is simple, even if it is not easy to accept. You were not sent here to follow a script. You were not sent here to spend your life reacting to circumstances that were designed by others. You were not sent here to trade your potential for comfort. You were sent here with something specific, something that requires your attention, your discipline, your commitment, and until you begin to acknowledge that, until you begin to question the life you have accepted as normal, that quiet tension inside you will remain, not as a flaw, not as a weakness, but as a signal that you have not yet stepped into the life that was meant for you. From the moment you begin to become aware of the world, long before you have the ability to question it, something else begins to take shape inside you. Not your dreams, not your purpose, but your programming, a quiet, consistent shaping of how you see yourself, what you believe is possible, and what you accept as normal. And the most dangerous part is that it never feels like control. It feels like guidance. It feels like care. It feels like preparation for life. But in reality, it is something far more powerful. It is the construction of a mindset that will either limit you or liberate you, depending on whether you ever become aware of it. You are not told to obey directly. No one stands in front of you and commands you to shrink your thinking or silence your ambition. Instead, you are shown a model, a pattern repeated so often that it begins to feel unquestionable. You are rewarded for following instructions, for giving the right answers, for staying within the lines. And over time, you begin to associate approval with compliance. You begin to feel safe when you are aligned with expectations, and uncomfortable when you are not. And this is how obedience is built, not through force, but through reinforcement. Think about how early it begins. You raise your hand before speaking. You wait to be called on. You learn that there is a correct answer, and that your role is to find it, not to challenge it. You are trained to memorize, to repeat, to perform, but rarely to create, rarely to question, rarely to step outside of what has already been defined. And while this system produces efficiency, It does something else quietly. It teaches you to look outward for direction instead of inward for purpose. And as you grow, this pattern does not disappear. It evolves. It becomes more sophisticated, more subtle. You are told to choose a path, but only from a predefined list. You are encouraged to think about your future, but only within the boundaries of what is considered practical. You are advised to follow your passion, but only if it aligns with stability. Only if it does not disrupt the system you have been placed in. And so even your sense of freedom becomes structured. Even your choices are guided in ways that keep you within a certain range. Over time, you begin to internalize these limits, not as rules imposed on you, but as truths about the world. You start to believe that certain goals are unrealistic, that certain paths are too risky, that certain ideas are not meant for people like you. And this belief does not come from evidence. It comes from repetition. It comes from hearing the same warnings, the same cautions, the same narratives over and over again until they no longer feel like opinions, they feel like reality. This is how programming works. It does not need to be loud. It does not need to be obvious. It only needs to be consistent, because the mind, especially the subconscious mind, accepts what is repeated with emotion as truth. It does not analyze deeply. It does not question authority. It absorbs. It records, and it builds patterns from what it is given. And once those patterns are established, they begin to guide your behavior automatically. You start to hesitate before taking risks, not because you have evaluated them fully, but because something inside you signals danger. You start to doubt your ideas before they are even tested. You start to seek validation before taking action. And all of this feels natural. It feels like you are being careful, like you are being responsible. But in reality, you are operating within a framework that was installed long before you had the awareness to choose it. And here is the deeper layer that most people never see. This programming is not only about what you do, it is about who you believe you are. It shapes your identity. It defines the boundaries of your self-image. It determines what you think you deserve, what you think you are capable of, and what you think is available to you. And once identity is shaped, behavior follows, because you will always act in a way that is consistent with who you believe yourself to be. If you believe you are someone who must play it safe, you will avoid opportunities that require boldness. If you believe you are someone who is not meant to lead, you will step back even when you have the ability to step forward. If you believe that success belongs to a different kind of person, you will unconsciously limit your own progress, not because you lack potential, but because your internal model does not allow you to see yourself in that position. This is why so many people remain stuck, not because they are incapable, but because they are conditioned. They are operating on instructions that were never consciously chosen. They are following patterns that were built through repetition, reinforced by environment, and protected by the illusion of normalcy. And as long as those patterns remain unexamined, they continue to run in the background, shaping decisions, influencing outcomes, and maintaining a life that feels predictable but unfulfilled. And yet, there is something remarkable about this process, something that shifts everything the moment you understand it. The same mechanism that was used to program limitation can be used to create expansion. The same subconscious that accepted those beliefs without resistance can accept new ones if they are introduced with enough clarity, enough repetition, and enough conviction. Because the mind does not care whether a belief limits you or empowers you. It only cares how often it is reinforced and how strongly it is felt. This means that what you have accepted as fixed is not fixed. What you have believed to be your nature is not your nature. It is a pattern, and patterns can be changed, but only when they are first recognized, Only when you become aware that the thoughts you think automatically are not necessarily your own, that the fears you feel automatically are not necessarily valid, that the limits you perceive automatically are not necessarily real. And this is where the shift begins. Not with a dramatic external change, but with a quiet internal realization that you have been trained, that you have been shaped, that much of what you have accepted as truth was given to you without your conscious agreement. And once you see that, once you truly see it, something inside you begins to loosen. Something begins to open. Because if you were trained into this way of thinking, then you are not bound to remain in it. But awareness alone is not enough. Because the programming that shaped you was not created in a single moment. It was built over years of repetition, reinforced daily, strengthened through emotion and experience, which means that changing it will require something just as consistent, just as deliberate, just as persistent. And that is where most people stop. They recognize the pattern, but they do not commit to rewriting it. They see the cage, but they do not walk out of it. Because walking out requires something uncomfortable. It requires you to think differently before you feel ready, to act differently before you feel confident, to believe something new before you have proof. And this goes against everything the old programming has taught you. It creates resistance. It creates doubt. It creates friction. But that friction is not a sign that you are wrong. It is a sign that you are stepping outside of the system that was designed to keep you where you are. And the moment you begin to question what you were taught, the moment you begin to choose your thoughts instead of repeating them, the moment you begin to act based on purpose instead of conditioning, you are no longer simply reacting to life. You are beginning to shape it. You are beginning to reclaim something that was always yours but was slowly taken from you without your awareness. And once that process begins, it does not reverse easily, because you can no longer pretend that you do not see what has been shaping you all along. There are no chains around your wrists, no visible barriers stopping you from moving forward, no one standing in your way telling you that you cannot become more. And yet, day after day, year after year, most people remain exactly where they are, repeating the same patterns, living within the same limits, circling the same frustrations, and calling it life. And if you look closely, not at what is visible, but at what is quietly shaping their choices, you begin to notice something far more powerful than force, something far more effective than restriction, something that does not need to control you physically because it has already conditioned you mentally. The first of these chains is ease, not comfort in its healthy form, but a subtle addiction to what requires the least resistance, the least effort, the least discomfort, because the human mind is designed to conserve energy, to avoid strain, to seek the path that feels smooth and predictable. And in a world that constantly offers convenience, speed, and instant relief, that tendency becomes amplified. It becomes a default setting, and before you realize it, you begin to choose what is easy over what is necessary, what is comfortable over what is meaningful, what is immediate over what is valuable. You delay action because it feels inconvenient. You avoid difficulty because it feels uncomfortable. You postpone growth because it requires effort. And each time you make that choice, it seems small. It seems harmless. It seems justified. But what you are actually doing is reinforcing a pattern that slowly trains your mind to resist anything that challenges it, anything that stretches it, anything that demands more from you than what you are used to giving. And over time, this pattern becomes so ingrained that you no longer question it. You simply follow it. And you call it your preference, your personality, your way of being, without realizing that it is nothing more than a conditioned response. And here is where it becomes dangerous, because ease does not present itself as a problem. It presents itself as relief. It tells you that you deserve to rest, that you should take it slow, that you have time. And while there is truth in rest, while there is value in balance, what ease quietly does is it removes the urgency from your life. It dulls your sense of purpose. It makes tomorrow feel just as acceptable as today. And when urgency disappears, action disappears with it. And when action disappears, potential remains unrealized. The second chain is debt, and this goes far beyond money. Although financial debt plays a powerful role in limiting freedom, because when you owe, you are no longer fully in control. Your decisions are influenced by obligations. Your choices are narrowed by necessity. Your risks are calculated not based on opportunity, but on survival. And this creates a form of dependency, a subtle but constant pressure that keeps you tied to a system that may not serve you, but that you cannot easily leave. But there is also another kind of debt, a psychological debt, a debt of expectation, where you feel obligated to meet the standards that have been set for you, to fulfill roles that were assigned to you, to live in a way that satisfies others even if it disconnects you from yourself. And this kind of debt is often invisible because it is not written down. It is not quantified, but it is felt. It is carried in the decisions you make, in the paths you choose, in the opportunities you decline, not because you do not want them, but because they do not align with what you believe you owe to the world around you. And when you combine ease with debt, something powerful happens. You begin to prioritize what is safe over what is significant. You begin to protect what you have instead of pursuing what you could create. You begin to manage your life instead of expanding it. And all of this feels responsible. It feels mature. It feels like you are doing the right thing. But beneath that surface, there is a quiet compromise taking place. A compromise between the life you are maintaining and the life you are capable of building. The third chain is false belief. And this is perhaps the most powerful of all, because while ease influences your actions and debt influences your decisions, belief influences your identity. It determines what you think is possible before you even attempt it. It sets the boundaries of your ambition. It shapes the way you interpret failure, success, risk, and opportunity. And once a belief is accepted, it does not need to be enforced. It enforces itself. If you believe that success is rare, you will treat it as something distant, something reserved for others. If you believe that failure is dangerous, you will avoid situations where growth is possible. If you believe that you are not ready, you will wait indefinitely for a moment that never arrives. And each of these beliefs operates quietly, without announcement, without resistance, guiding your behavior in ways that feel natural but are anything but neutral. False beliefs are not always obvious. They often disguise themselves as logic, less realism, as experience. They are supported by examples, by stories, by observations that seem to confirm them, and because of that, they are rarely challenged. They are accepted, repeated, and reinforced until they become part of your internal dialogue, shaping how you speak to yourself, how you evaluate your progress, how you respond to setbacks, and most importantly, how you define your limits. And when these three chains work together, ease, debt, and false belief, they create a system that is incredibly difficult to escape because it does not feel like a prison. It feels like life. It feels normal. It feels familiar. And that familiarity is what keeps it in place, because you do not question what you have accepted as standard. You do not resist what you have adapted to. You do not challenge what you have internalized. You wake up, you follow your routine. You make your decisions based on what feels manageable, what feels expected, what feels safe. And in doing so, you continue to reinforce the very patterns that keep you where you are, not because you lack the ability to move beyond them, but because you have not yet disrupted the system that sustains them. But the moment you begin to see these chains for what they are, not as permanent conditions, but as constructed patterns, something shifts. Because what is constructed can be deconstructed, what is learned can be unlearned, and what is repeated can be replaced. But only if you are willing to confront the discomfort that comes with breaking away from what is familiar. Because breaking away from ease means choosing effort when it is easier not to. Breaking away from debt means reclaiming control over your decisions, even when it requires sacrifice. And breaking away from false belief means questioning the very thoughts that have guided you for years. And that process is not comfortable. It is not immediate. It is not effortless, but it is necessary. And as you begin to challenge these patterns, as you begin to act differently, think differently, and choose differently, you will notice resistance, not only from within yourself, but from the environment around you. Because anything that disrupts a system will be met with pressure to return to it, but that pressure is not a signal to stop. It is a confirmation that you are stepping outside of what once controlled you. And once you step outside, even slightly, even imperfectly, you begin to experience something that was not available to you before. Not because it did not exist, but because you were not aligned with it. You begin to experience movement, direction, possibility, not as distant concepts, but as immediate realities. And that experience changes everything, because it shows you that the limits you once accepted were never absolute. They were conditional, and conditions can change. There is a moment in almost every life that no one talks about, not because it is rare, but because it is so common that it has been mistaken for normal. A moment where a person does not fail, does not collapse, does not lose everything in some dramatic way, but instead quietly surrenders, not to circumstances, not to a specific event, but to a way of living that slowly replaces who they could have become with who they are willing to accept. And the most dangerous part is that this surrender does not feel like defeat. It feels like maturity. It feels like responsibility. It feels like finally understanding how the world works. You can see it in the shift that happens over time, where ambition begins to soften, where bold ideas begin to sound unrealistic, where risk begins to feel unnecessary, and what was once a desire to build, to create, to expand, is gradually replaced with a desire to maintain, to protect, to avoid loss. And on the surface, this looks like growth. It looks like becoming wiser, more grounded, more practical. But beneath that surface, something else is taking place, something far more permanent. The gradual shrinking of possibility. At first, the surrender is subtle. It shows up in small decisions. You decide not to take a chance because the timing is not right. You decide not to speak up because it might create tension. You decide not to pursue something because it seems uncertain. And each of these decisions feels justified. It feels logical. It feels safe. But what you do not realize is that you are not just avoiding risk. You are conditioning your mind to associate discomfort with danger. You are training yourself to retreat instead of advance, to hesitate instead of act. And over time, this pattern becomes automatic. And once it becomes automatic, something changes in the way you see yourself. You begin to identify with caution. You begin to define yourself by what you avoid rather than what you pursue. You begin to build an identity around stability, around predictability, around staying within limits. And because this identity is reinforced by your environment, by the people around you who are making similar choices, by a culture that rewards consistency over creativity. You begin to feel validated in your surrender. This is why most people never recognize the moment it happens, because it is not presented as a loss. It is presented as progress. It is celebrated, encouraged, reinforced. And by the time the consequences become visible, by the time the sense of stagnation becomes undeniable, by the time the quiet dissatisfaction turns into something harder to ignore, the pattern has already been established. The identity has already been formed. And breaking away from it feels far more difficult than staying within it. But the deeper reason why this surrender happens has little to do with external pressure and everything to do with internal belief. Because long before a person stops taking action, they stop believing in what is possible for them. They begin to doubt not just the outcome, but their own capacity to create it. And once that doubt takes hold, action becomes inconsistent. Effort becomes conditional. And eventually, pursuit becomes optional. The mind, when filled with uncertainty, seeks resolution. It looks for evidence. It looks for proof. And when it does not find immediate confirmation that success is guaranteed, it begins to withdraw. It begins to protect itself from potential failure, from potential embarrassment, from potential loss. And in doing so, it convinces you that stepping back is the intelligent choice, that waiting is the responsible choice, that staying where you are is the safe choice. But what is rarely understood is that this form of safety comes with a cost that is not immediate, not obvious, but cumulative, because every time you choose not to act, every time you choose not to move forward, every time you choose not to pursue what calls you, you are not just avoiding failure. You are also avoiding growth. You are avoiding experience. You are avoiding the very process that would have expanded your capacity and strengthened your belief. And so, over time, the absence of action becomes the absence of evidence. And the absence of evidence reinforces the doubt, creating a cycle that feeds itself. You do not act because you do not believe. And you do not believe because you have not acted. And within that cycle, surrender becomes inevitable. Not because you are incapable, but because you have gradually disconnected from the part of yourself that was willing to try. There is also another force at work, one that is less obvious but equally powerful, the influence of time. Because as the years pass, the stakes begin to feel higher. The responsibilities begin to increase. The margin for error begins to feel smaller. And what might have once felt like an opportunity now feels like a risk. What might have once felt like a possibility now feels like a threat. And this shift in perception makes it even easier to justify inaction, to justify staying within the known, to justify maintaining what you have instead of pursuing what you could build. And yet, beneath all of this, beneath the logic, beneath the reasoning, beneath the justifications, there remains a quiet awareness, a sense that something has been left behind, that something has not been fully expressed, that the life you are living, while functional, while acceptable, while even successful by certain standards, does not fully reflect what you are capable of. And this awareness does not disappear. It lingers. It resurfaces in moments of stillness, in moments of reflection, in moments where you are not distracted by routine. Most people ignore it, not because they do not feel it, but because acknowledging it would require a confrontation with the choices they have made, with the paths they have taken, with the version of themselves they have become. And that confrontation is uncomfortable. It challenges the identity they have built. It questions the direction they have followed. And so it is easier to silence it, to push it aside, to return to what is familiar. But for those who do not ignore it, For those who allow themselves to sit with that awareness, to explore it, to question it, something begins to change. Because in that awareness lies the recognition that surrender was not a necessity. It was a decision, not a single decision made in one moment, but a series of decisions made over time, each one small, each one justified, each one reinforcing the next, until the pattern became a path. And if surrender was built through decisions, then it can be undone through decisions, not through a single dramatic shift, not through a sudden transformation, but through a deliberate choice to begin again, to act where you once hesitated, to pursue where you once avoided, to believe where you once doubted. And while this does not erase the past, it changes the direction of the future, because the truth is, life does not end when you surrender. It continues. It moves forward. It carries you with it. But the difference between a life that is lived fully and a life that is merely maintained is determined by whether you continue to follow the pattern of surrender or whether you interrupt it. Whether you continue to accept the limits that have been placed on you or whether you begin to question them. And that question, simple as it may seem, is where everything begins to shift. There is a law operating within you at all times, whether you are aware of it or not. A law that does not ask for your permission, does not require your understanding, and does not pause simply because you choose to ignore it. A law that quietly governs the direction of your life through something far more subtle than action alone. Through the thoughts you allow, the words you repeat, and the identity you accept as your own. And once you begin to see how this law works, you begin to understand that your life has not been shaped by chance, but by a process that has been running in the background of your mind for years. Every thought you entertain, especially the ones you repeat with emotion, leaves an imprint, not just as a passing idea, but as a suggestion, a command delivered to the deeper part of your mind that does not question, that does not argue, that simply receives and acts. And this is where most people misunderstand the nature of their own thinking. They believe that thoughts are temporary, that they come and go without consequence, but the truth is that repeated thoughts become instructions, and instructions, when accepted, become patterns, and patterns, when reinforced, become identity. If you consistently think in terms of limitation, if you repeatedly tell yourself that you are not ready, that you are not capable, that circumstances are against you, those thoughts do not remain harmless. They accumulate. They settle. They begin to define the way you see yourself and the world. And once that definition is established, your behavior aligns with it, not because you consciously choose it, but because you are acting in accordance with what you believe to be true. This is the law of inner command, the principle that your subconscious mind responds to the dominant thoughts you feed it, and it does so without discrimination, without judgment. It does not decide whether a thought is beneficial or harmful. It only recognizes repetition and emotional intensity. And whatever is repeated often enough, with enough conviction, becomes accepted as reality within you. And once it is accepted, it begins to influence your actions, your decisions, your habits, and ultimately, your results. This is why two individuals with similar circumstances can produce entirely different outcomes, not because one is inherently more capable than the other, but because one has conditioned their mind to expect growth, to pursue opportunity, to persist in the face of difficulty, while the other has conditioned their mind to anticipate obstacles, to avoid risk, to withdraw when challenged. And each of them is simply acting out the commands that have been reinforced within them over time. What most people fail to realize is that this process is happening continuously, not just in moments of intention, but in the quiet repetition of everyday thought, in the casual statements you make about yourself, in the assumptions you hold about what is possible, in the way you interpret success and failure. And because these patterns are familiar, because they feel natural, they are rarely questioned. They are accepted as part of your personality, when in reality, they are the result of conditioning. But the moment you become aware of this law, the moment you recognize that your thoughts are not passive, that they are active forces shaping your identity, you are presented with a choice that most people overlook. You can continue to allow your mind to operate on patterns that were installed without your awareness, or you can begin to take control of what is being repeated, what is being reinforced, what is being accepted as truth. And this is where repetition becomes a tool rather than a trap. Because just as negative patterns were built through repetition, empowering patterns can be built the same way, not through occasional effort, not through temporary motivation, but through consistent, deliberate reinforcement of thoughts that align with the person you intend to become. And this requires something that goes against your current conditioning. It requires you to think in advance of evidence, to believe before results appear, to act as if what you are building is already in motion, even when external proof has not yet caught up. This is not about pretending. It is not about ignoring reality. It is about understanding that reality itself is influenced by the internal framework through which you perceive and respond to it. And when that framework changes, when your dominant thoughts shift from doubt to direction, from hesitation to commitment, your actions begin to reflect that shift. And over time, those actions produce outcomes that reinforce the new identity you are building. Identity is not something fixed. It is not something you are born with and cannot change. It is something that is constructed, something that is shaped by what you repeatedly tell yourself about who you are. And once an identity is formed, it becomes the filter through which you interpret everything. It determines what you notice, what you pursue, what you avoid, and what you believe you deserve. And this is why changing behavior alone is not enough. Because if your identity remains unchanged, your behavior will eventually return to what is familiar. If you see yourself as someone who lacks discipline, you will struggle to maintain consistent action. Even if you begin with strong intention, if you see yourself as someone who is not capable of achieving a certain level of success, you will unconsciously limit your effort, your vision, your persistence, not because you are unwilling, but because your internal definition does not support that outcome. And until that definition changes, progress will always feel temporary. But when you begin to deliberately construct a new identity, when you begin to define yourself based on the direction you are choosing rather than the results you have already produced, something shifts. You no longer wait to feel confident before acting. You act in a way that builds confidence. You no longer wait for external validation to believe in yourself. You generate that belief internally through repetition, through discipline, through consistent alignment between what you think, what you say,